Hello and welcome to The Edition from The Spectator. I'm Lara Prendergast, The Spectator's executive editor, and the latest issue of the magazine has just gone to press. To discuss what's in it, I'm joined now by our political editor, Tim Shipman, our life columnist, Rachel Johnson, and our features editor and my co-host, William Moore. This week's headline is Iran's Useful Idiots, and in this piece we look at the unfolding events in Iran as well as the British complicity in the events. So, Will, could you start by outlining how this week's cover came about?
Well, I mean, obviously the protests in Iran have now been bubbling away with various degrees of intensity since the end of December. But then this week, Donald Trump has meant that it really is the kind of unavoidable news story of the moment, because he's been sending out his messages on his social channels saying help is on the way. What that means, help is on the way, is obviously open to interpretation at this moment, but it means that I think protesters feel quite emboldened by the idea of American support. And so these are protests the like of which have not been seen for a very, very long time. And we have several fantastic pieces in the magazine which are speaking to that. The main one being by Sir John Jenkins, who's the former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, who writes about how Britain is getting so much of their approach to Iran wrong, or what he would want to do about it. And we've also got a fantastic piece by Charlie Gamble, who himself is former Foreign Office, about how this is sort of likely to play out. And he says that there's a kind of false dichotomy between the idea that the regime will always survive and be stable and the idea that it's always just about to topple and there'll be some glorious new revolution that'll restore democracy or whatever else. And actually, there's quite a lot of places in between that, and many of them are not good, such as full-on civil war. So there's all these excellent pieces. There's a unifying line between them, though, which is how useless Britain often is when it comes to Iran. Inept, often quite naive, and has quite a wrong approach when it comes to how they deal with the regime. And actually, it's something I would love Tim's opinion on as political editor. Do you think that John Jenkins is right that that Britain's entire approach to the Iranian regime is just never has worked and needs reforming?
Well, arguably it hasn't worked since the Mossadegh coup of 1953.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting here is reading both a former diplomat and a former ambassador's views that the Foreign Office is hopeless. Well, colour me surprised. They often get international affairs wrong. And Gamel's piece, I think, in particular is interesting because he's saying in 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini was just one of many people who may have emerged. It wasn't necessarily predictable in advance. So Britain ought really to be casting its net wide and looking at all sorts of possible outcomes here. But the point that both these men make, particularly John Jenkins, is that the Foreign Office sort of takes the view that the regime won't fall, so what's the fuss about? And he also says, what's the point of even talking to Iran?
Yeah.
There's a great line here about, the many long and dismal hours I used to waste speaking to Iranian diplomats in London. It would be no great shakes if we cut off diplomatic relations and they no longer had an embassy here and we no longer had one in Tehran. I also think back years and years and years ago to a briefing I received when we were doing this nuclear deal, what became the JCPOA with Iran back in the day. They were supposed to be accepting sort of money and more openness, end of sanctions in exchange for monitoring their nuclear program. And we got a very high-level briefing from one of the bright young stars of the Cabinet Office, who was a chap called John Sawyers. And he went on about what a wonderful thing it was going to be to do this deal with Iran and how we probably really could trust what the Iranians were going to tell us about all of this. And Sawyers went on to be the head of MI6 a few years later. And lo and behold, it turns out, 2 decades on, that everything he told us was complete codswallop at the time, and wishful thinking, frankly. And I'm slightly surprised that John Jenkins thinks we shouldn't have an embassy in Tehran, because when I was writing about the Israeli bombing of Iran back in June, when I'd
Your first cover piece for it.
First cover piece with The Spectator, I was told on very good authority, we don't want to close the embassy because the Americans don't have an embassy and they have quite a lot of spies in town who might like to operate in and around our embassy. The implication was that there was a senior regime person talking to people in the West. I've been led to believe by all sorts of people that there are senior regime assets talking to both us and to the Americans, and that's why you want, on pain of death, you don't need to talk to the regime. They're only ever going to lie to you. But keep maintaining a presence in country, particularly at a time like this of sort of febrile change where all sorts of people could be coming through and about to play a role in the future of Iran. Going back to what both men say about how we've got it wrong in the past and how, just simply saying the regime won't fall is not good enough. Gamel's piece in particular makes the point that it may not be about to fall now, but we may have passed the point of no return.
Yeah. He thinks it's broken beyond repair.
And you think about the Soviet Union in the mid-'80s. It didn't fall apart then, but it was perfectly possible to see at that point that it was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions and did not have the support it needed or the financial clout to get itself out of trouble. And the harder Reagan and Thatcher pushed, 4 or 5 years later, it all imploded. And we could well be in a similar situation here. But as Charlie Gamble says, predicting the future is nearly impossible, and having people on the ground who are prepared to think openly about what the future might bring rather than on these tram lines of democracy or theocracy. What emerges is probably going to be possibly more palatable than what we've got, but not as palatable as we would like. And within those shades of grey, there's quite a lot of work to be done, I would have thought.
Yeah.
Rachel, Charlie's piece is probably the most pessimistic out of the three, but he also says that what could happen is civil war and terror. Do you think generally it's good to be pretty sceptical about any kind of regime change?
I think we're in a kind of catch-22 when it comes to looking at foreign intervention and how the West can assist these indescribally brave counter-revolutionaries, because the more the West does, the more Trump tweets about Iran, the more the mullahs and the ayatollahs can blame the West for whatever happens and all the deaths that are occurring on the streets. And it could be tens of thousands. We don't know. We can't tell because, of course, the internet is down and no news is coming out, no journalists are going in. So there is this weird sense of, the more the West does, it could be counterproductive. Whose doctrine is the Pottery Barn doctrine? You broke it, you bought it.
That's kind of Colin Powell.
Colin Powell. So Trump has tweeted, go out, attack the institutions, take the names of your abusers and your attackers. Right. Well, this puts a target on the back of all those people he's encouraging and inciting to go out on the streets. Essentially, the under 30s, the flower of Persia. He's encouraging them to go out and get shot. Now, so if he does not come to their help in some shape or form, I think this is on Trump. A lot of this could be on Trump. And at the very least, the regime will blame Trump.
Yeah. What happens for Britain, Tim, if America does somehow get involved? What does that mean for us?
Well, it makes life very difficult because we've already seen enough to know that some people in the government are having an aneurysm about Britain having to have any kind of public position on what's going on in Iran.
Go on, say it.
There hasn't been
say the quiet part out loud.
There hasn't been very much said by the government. I mean, they're talking much more. They're talking much more about Elon Musk and X and Grok than they are about Iran.
I go back to that first piece I wrote on Iran back in June. I was told that Keir Starmer, of course, was quite impressed by the Israeli raid on the Iranian nuclear facilities and was perfectly happy to express some kind of calm association with it. But Lord Hermer, Richard Hermer, the Attorney General, his brother in human rights fanaticism, was not having any of it and basically told all ministers that it was essentially illegal what had been done and that they couldn't, on pain of death, talk about it publicly. And a similar silence has been the case over Venezuela. And again, I'm told, and I wrote last Friday in our end of week political email that again, Starmer was not going to weep tears over the fate of Nicolas Maduro until not just Hermer, but Foreign Office lawyers, Cabinet Office lawyers all rode in and said, well, no, this is technically a breach of international law. So Starmer is obviously in a very difficult position when Trump is rampaging around doing anything, but it gets much more complicated when you get into a situation where the political leadership of a country may not be quite in the same place where the permanent civil service and diplomatic corps, it is a given in the Foreign Office that, most of the permanent officials are Arabists and sort of deeply in love with Islamic culture and think Israel is the root of all evil. So anything that looks like foreign interference in Iran is likely to get their goat. But I think back again to comments that Netanyahu made at the time of those Israeli bombing raids. He was making similar noises to Trump. He was effectively saying, it's coming, it'll be coming soon. And, look, rush to ever make predictions in international politics. But were countries like that to get involved, you've seen what Israel did with the pager attacks, taking out the Hezbollah leadership. There have been very senior people killed in Iran. It would not surprise me at all, given what we think we know about the level of intelligence sources in the regime who are beginning to lose faith in the leadership, if it was known quite well where some of those senior leaders are, and if, a bomb was put in their loo, essentially. So let's watch it. As Rachel says, even without that level of involvement, the mullahs will say it's all the West's fault. But, Trump is getting himself in a position where he has a bit of a moral responsibility now to back these people up. Because you think of what happened in Kuwait during the first Gulf War. It was, we went in, liberated Kuwait, and the Marsh Arabs rose up in southern Iraq thinking that the tanks were going to keep going to Baghdad, and they didn't. And Saddam Hussein massacred those people. So having provided this level of encouragement and egging on, then it sort of suggests that the Americans or the Israelis might have something up their sleeve, but if they don't, they're going to probably have quite a lot of blood on their hands.
Side question to you, Tim, very quickly on Keir Starmer's kind of slightly supine response so far to Venezuela and to Iran. Should he accept being on the board of Gaza, given that this could be a kind of Trump family real estate deal?
Well, look, I think whenever Gaza raises its head, it's the thing that the left of the Labour Party cares about more than anything. So if he is trying to get some kind of kudos with his own side, getting involved in Gaza makes more sense than some of these other things. And I guess his argument to those people would be, well, at least if I'm watching it, that we might at least have some visibility rather than stuff in Venezuela where the president didn't bother to pick up the phone for 3 or 4 days to tell me anything about it. But I think the thing with Starmer and the reason he's prepared to look supine is partly that Herma has tied his hands. But I think a large part of it is he knows he has only certain opportunities to influence Trump. And I think he would rather do that on Ukraine than on anything else. And now perhaps on Greenland as well, where there's a lot of concern about the Americans kind of going into a NATO. He's got to pick his battles. He's got to choose his hill. And his top hill to die on is to keep support for the Ukrainians, I believe.
Tim, speaking of Blair, let's talk about your political column this week, because you say that rather than seeing Keir Starmer's government as being heavily influenced by Blair, it is in fact Gordon Brown who's exerting the most influence on it right now. How so exactly? Yeah,
this came about. I watched two people shouting at each other at a Christmas party. One of them a Starmerite, one of them a Blairite, and they didn't really agree on a great deal about anything. And I mentioned this to somebody else, and they said, well, of course they don't. The Blairites have basically given up on this government because this is Gordon Brown's second term. And I got to thinking about this and thought there was something in this. You look at what happened when Starmer and Brown took over after years of sort of positioning themselves for the job. Neither of them really had much of an idea of what they wanted to do with the job. Insofar as this government has now got a vision, it's sort of one that's come about a little bit by accident, but it's very much the sort of Brownite view of top-down, state tells you what's good for you, we take your money and then give you some things back and say that that's what we want to do, whereas Blair was all about sort of trying to reform the state and empower voters as sort of consumers of public services, and that's all sort of gone by the by. And I've been talking to Brownites for years, and they've always been a bit disappointed and said, well, if only Tony had made way earlier after, he didn't wait 10 years, Gordon would have had a clearer run at it, would have had a real Labour government, it would have been marvellous. But it seems to me that a lot of what is going wrong with this government is precisely what would have gone wrong with the Brown government had he had more time. There's also a parallel, I think, in, the one thing Gordon Brown got right, the thing that will ultimately save his reputation was his response to the global financial crisis. And you see in Starmer jumping on a plane and going off trying to solve Ukraine and Greenland and Iran and whatever else it is this week. Gaza, this desperate attempt to be a sort of statesman, because all the stuff on the home front is very difficult and very grotty and very dirty and requires sort of a bit of narrative and vision that the Prime Minister seems to lack. So it seems to me the parallels are there. The other thing that's sort of striking is Brown was this sort of iron, strong chancellor with whatever you think of what he was trying to do. It was a kind of coherent set of plans. And this Treasury and this Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, don't seem to have that at all, even though she's a big fan of Brown's. And, insofar as she has a philosophy, it's a Brownite one. But actually, when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, he was desperate to subjugate the Treasury. He wanted to, as someone is quoted here saying, run it at remote control. So maybe this is the fullest realisation of what a year 6 Brown government would have looked like, with the Treasury kind of totally subjugated to number 10. You've seen this in recent weeks, where they've basically battered Rachel Reeves until she has caved in on the inheritance tax raid on the farmers. We're now seeing a U-turn pending on the business rate rise against pubs, and the Treasury has become this kind of denuded thing. So my ultimate conclusion is that at the very moment where the country needed Gordon Brown the Chancellor, we've instead ended up with Gordon Brown the Prime Minister, who was weak, lacking direction, unlike the sort of previous iteration as Chancellor of the Exchequer. So Starmer could do with Brown as his Chancellor, and the country could do with someone other than a Gordon Brown retread as Prime Minister.
I think it might be the most depressing analysis I've read so far of depressing.
Even worse than Charlie Gammell's assessment of Iran.
It's possibly. It is. It's obviously depressing in, I think, how accurate it is. But the idea that Gordon Brown has kind of never left or is returned, like a kind of horror movie. Yeah, it's like a zombie.
He's
coming
also
out
got
of the grave.
influence. There was a period where Blair and Starmer were speaking semi-regularly, and Blair sort of thought, well, we've got Starmer, we might as well try and make him good.
Yeah.
That process is now over. Obviously for slightly different reasons, but Peter Mandelson has departed, big Blairite. A lot of the sort of Blairite agenda that Morgan McSweeney was sort of pushing, reform, 6, 8, 9 months ago, that's all gone, and we've gone back to a kind of boilerplate left-wing administration.
Yeah. Don't you think it once left with this real... I'm really struggling to work out who is running the country, because under... Let's say in the TBGBs, it was possibly the Treasury, because obviously Gordon Brown was very influential as Chancellor, then he became Prime Minister. So you could sort of see who had their hands on the levers. But with this government, you saw with the first budget and then even the second budget, the Treasury was putting things under her nose that every single former Chancellor for 14 years, and there have been a number of them, wouldn't have touched with a barge pole. I mean, George Osborne will say this to your face. He'll say, ha, 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 VAT on private schools, or ha, 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 changes to IHT. He said they tried that over and over again with me.
And if you read Damon McBride's book on his time with Gordon Brown, his chapter on how budgets are made is full of stuff where every time you start to write a budget, the Treasury officials produce this roll call of stuff they want to do.
They've got a whole bundle of stuff.
And it's all politically insane, and you need to get rid of it.
And Rachel Reeves sucked it up.
She did.
And that's why you're seeing all these U-turns.
But there's also a sense that the officials in the Treasury are not as good as they used to be. I'm quoting a former senior Mandarin here, basically saying they're all rubbish now. There's infighting in the department. The permanent secretary is not really in control. This source says, they used to at least be Stalinist in their hierarchy and their views, and now they're not even that.
Yeah.
But, while Blair is no longer on the phone to Starmer, Brown himself is. Now, anyone who knows anything about Gordon Brown knows that he's constantly, he sits at home getting angry about things, and he picks up the phone, and whoever's leader of the Labour Party, even when it was Jeremy Corbyn, would get the odd call. Certainly when it was Ed Miliband, he was on the phone all the time. And now with Starmer, he's in his ear. And someone, told me, Gordon Brown used to be a sort of nuisance caller to leaders of the Labour Party. He was kind of, I remember when he was obsessed with devolution and doing something in Scotland. And he was basically told by Starmer at the beginning, go off and look at that, Gordon.
Yeah.
That'll keep you busy for 2 years and stop you phoning me up about everything else. But now, he was the one pushing on child poverty and demanding an end to the 2-child benefit cap. And Brown himself is actively driving this stuff, whereas Blair's people basically say the bloke's given up on Starmer, and the Tony Blair Foundation, which comes up with quite a lot of decent ideas, is barely having any kind of feed into government these days. And there we go, Gordon Brown's second term. Read it and weep.
Well, I mean, someone's trying.
I did.
I mean, this is the scoop, really. We know now who's running the country. And
If you could choose between Gordon Brown or Keir Starmer, if there's
Gordon Brown
every
time.
And the quote here, this is a former Labour cabinet minister Gordon had dense knowledge, constant curiosity, and intellectual flair, whatever his other flaws. Brackets, this particular character could have gone on for 20 more sentences at that point. Keir just has the flaws, a vapidness and uninterest in economics, which is startling. So even the people who see the parallels think it's a very generous, generous parallel for Starmer.
even your question.
So we haven't even got Gordon Brown. We've got a sort of terrible ghost of Gordon Brown.
That's what I thought when you asked that question to Rachel, Lara. It was, it's either Gordon Brown or knock off Gordon Brown.
Fake Gordon Brown.
To quote Chicken Run, the greatest film ever made, are those the only choices?
Well, an enterprising opposition politician might call him a pound shop Gordon Brown.
By the way, that we have to say, and we're recording this on after PMQs, he did have quite a good PMQ. Someone is writing quite good jokes for Keir.
But delivering them with such leaden kind of... It's almost like he wants to put up a sign going, they've given me a joke. Look, I'm doing a joke. We're going to do the joke now. It's all going to be fine.
That'd be quite funny if you did that.
Yeah, I mean, and some of them landed with the aplomb of me trying to do gymnastics.
As a visual.
Sticking briefly on domestic politics, we've got two pieces which I thought I'd just briefly mention. One is Max Jeffrey, who's been in Oldham and was reporting on the increasing kind of secular politics going on there. We also have a column by Douglas Murray, who's also talking about how racial politics are increasingly kind of prominent in Britain right now. And he talks particularly about the number of Muslim politicians that Reform is now fielding. Tim, do you think Reform are being very canny with what they are doing with Layla Cunningham and Nadeem Zahawi, or could it, as Douglas suggests, potentially backfire?
Yeah, I think this has become a big theme of our politics. There are a whole host of Labour MPs, including senior members of the Cabinet, both Wes Streeting and Shabana Mahmood, two of the sort of 3 or 4 likely people to be the next leader of the Labour Party, might all lose their seats to people who, frankly, campaign on issues that are more to do with Gaza than they are to do with their home seats. We've seen this. We've got 5 of these MPs now. Most pollsters I speak to would not be surprised if we had 20 after the next election. I think the extent of the cut-through of this will become clearer in May during the local elections, where we'll get some idea of how widespread this is going to be on an enduring basis, or whether that the immediacy of Gaza, which was very big during the general election campaign, has slightly faded a little. Reform has got that sort of irate white working class, hates the establishment, hates the old parties vote sewn up, but they're trying to broaden their appeal to people in other ethnic groups. They're also trying to broaden their appeal to the sort of middle class vote that looks at Nigel Farage and says, well, everybody says he's a racist, but there's all these brown faces at the top of the party. Everyone says he's an Islamophobe, but his London mayoral candidate is a Muslim lady. His highest profile signing from the Conservative Party was a Kurdish refugee who came to Britain with very little and made his way into being a millionaire businessman. So they're trying to broaden that out, and they're trying to go from being a sort of 28-30% party to being a sort of 35% party. And if Farage can get them there, then they really will look in a very strong position to win the next election, and not just win it, but with a majority.
So Douglas makes a really interesting point, I think, in his column. There's another side of the argument, which isn't that Farage shouldn't be dallying with these people, because they're Muslim or not white or whatever else. It's just that to try to play a game of identity politics and make a kind of big thing about the fact that your London mayoral candidate is Muslim, for example, that is a mistake. You can kind of claim to be anti-identity politics, but if you then play the game of identity politics, almost like in reverse, and say, well, I can't be racist, I've got,
Yeah, or if you need a Muslim candidate to counter a Muslim candidate, that's what he says.
Right, yeah, exactly. So if you're trying to say, if you're trying to play it by essentially the game of, well, look how many people I've got around me who are not me, or not like me, you're sort of entering the terms of engagement, which is just worth not even going there. You see what I mean? Yeah, it's worth us not. You should just not even play the game.
Yeah, I think that's right to a degree, but I think Farage's response, if he was sitting here, is that he's not actually going to make a big thing of it. You can gather this information by osmosis, essentially. You can see these faces around him. You don't need to make a huge song and dance out of it. I mean, he accepted Nadeem Zahawi crossing the floor because Nadeem Zahawi is a former Chancellor of the Exchequer and has more experience of cabinet government than any of the other previous people who has crossed the floor. I think he picked Layla Cunningham, not because she's Muslim, but because she's one of the 3 or 4 most effective media performers in his party, and he wanted to put her in a prominent role. So does it have some kind of benefit taking on Sadiq Khan or another Labour candidate from a similar corner of the society? Maybe, but I think it's more about she's feisty, she knows her own mind, and she can, turn up and give an interview without falling flat on her face.
I think the point of it should be for reform to use these candidates as a sort of tip of the spear to show that you are a broad base, and just because you have a Muslim mayor or you have a Muslim chairman like Zia Yusuf, indeed, even if there's a Muslim Home Secretary like Shabana Mahmood, you will not be coloured by your own religious ideology. And I think it's quite smart if all the parties adopted a much more colour-blind, religion-blind selection policy and appointment policy, because it would be such a relief. Because I think what happened today, Shabana Mahmood saying she had no confidence in the West Midlands police chief, is very significant, because basically that's her marker saying, I may be a Muslim, I may have said that Islam informs everything I do, but when it comes to policy, when it comes to action, when it comes to accountability, I will not be influenced. And I think Nigel could use it in the same way and appoint people in the same way to some general benefit, I think, as a country. But it remains to be seen whether he will use it as a kind of, as a way of getting the Muslim bloc vote in the various constituencies where Labour's on the skids. Who knows?
I think there's a certain tendency to people on the right, and I'm talking now not about politicians, but actually about a lot of voters on the right, who almost have a slightly fetishistic idea about right-wing non-white women in particular. So they might almost think, Suella Braverman is saying what I think about immigration, and also she's saying it as a brown woman, and that gets them very, very excited, and they sort of and they kind of feel like they can.
I wasn't sure where it was going for a while.
No,
to be
I
honest.
was a bit concerned.
I actually think for sections of the right, it's not actually irrelevant in that they quite like the fact that someone who is not a sort of white male is saying it.
I mean, it's now very unusual not to appoint an Asian Home Secretary, to be honest.
Exactly. But I guess my only point is that,
Sajid Javid, Suella Braverman,
is that there's
James
a
Cleverly,
Pretty.
Chris Patel.
My only point is there's a certain section of the right that thinks she says what we can't say.
Yeah.
To which I almost think, well, if you believe something and you believe it's true and you believe it's defensible, then just say it.
But
just
you know
defend it
what?
yourself. You don't hide behind Suella Braverman or Kemi Badenoch or some non-white woman to make your point for you. Make your point. Have the guts to say it yourself.
I think that's an admirable case in a vacuum, but in the modern world where life can get quite complicated, I think it's quite a useful human shield to have a brown woman out there saying these things. And I don't think that Farage is playing it too much, and I don't actually think the Conservative Party has played it too much. The huge moral strength of the Conservative Party, able to turn around to the Labour Party and say, we had the first woman leader, we had the second woman leader, we had the third woman leader to be Prime Minister, we had the first brown this, the first Asian that, the first black that. And in almost every case, with the exception of Paul Boateng, I think was the first black cabinet minister, the Tories have led the way on this stuff. And, it's embarrassing for Labour, who are obsessed with identity politics, that they're obsessed with it, apart from when they come to elect a leader. Yvette Cooper is, our Foreign Secretary. She's finished a distant third when she stood for the leadership. Every time a woman has stood...
Harriet Harman ditto.
Every time a woman has stood to be leader of the Labour Party, they have finished last. Every single time.
Yeah. I don't know. I just think there's sections of the right that's actually as obsessed with all this.
Maybe so, but I don't think that section of the right is necessarily running the political parties. I mean, I think when Rishi Sunak became the first Asian Prime Minister, the first non-white Prime Minister, nobody batted an eyelid. And that was the greatest victory of all, really. It was probably Sunak's only big win, really, from the time he became Prime Minister. The lack of attention to that was absolutely staggering.
Do you think we could have our first black woman Prime Minister soon?
I'm struggling to think who that might be.
Can't be.
Should we try that one again?
So let's move on. I was going to take us across the Atlantic now, because Rachel, you've written your lovely column from New York, where you've just been.
Am I allowed to say that I had a very fun evening with Katy Balls, late of this parish?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I did. And so Katy Balls' evening starts at about 5 in the afternoon.
And it's still going strong at 5 the next morning.
Yes. At the time of recording, it's still going on. Yeah.
I think it must be because of timing. That's it. She has to get up very early. So her evening starts early, but her day starts very early, okay, because of the time. I met her for cocktails in a bar with a former advisor to, who is the leather-jacketed one called Liam? You remember that one?
Yes.
That spad
Yeah.
called
Smith.
Liam.
Booth Smith.
That's it.
The chief of staff in Downing Street. That's bad.
See, well, anyway, they'd had a drink had been already taken by the time I arrived, and then I took Katy out to an FT party, Christmas party, where much more drink was taken.
This sounds very ideal.
But then Katy took out her phone, and she had an app on her phone called Partify, which told her which were the next 3 parties she had to be present at, and whether she'd RSVP'd, and what was the dress code, and was it bring a bottle, and was it Republican, was it Democrat, was it, out in Arlington, Virginia with the CIA. It's just unbelievable. And then it all happened again the next day. We met in Georgetown in a bar at about 5 o'clock and carried on from there.
She is very impressive, her approach to partying.
Exhausting.
It is exhausting.
I think it is the job, actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, she's doing very well there.
Yeah.
Mickey Dan has also written in the diary this week. He's the co-creator of Industry, and he's writing from New York. And he says, New York is a city that he loves, but he always leaves thinking, get me out of here. Is that something you also recognise?
It's interesting because having lived in both cities and having been in both cities just in the last few weeks, I would definitely choose DC over New York now, because it's clean.
It's a sign of maturity.
I know. It's clean. You can walk.
Trees on every street by
It's
federal law.
leafy.
National Guard on every street.
Whereas New York is, it's a jungle.
Rachel,
It's great fun.
Is this you?
It's great
Is
fun.
this you subliminally praising Donald Trump for his clampdown on DC?
Clean up of the streets.
Yeah.
Has he? I mean, I didn't see any ICE agents in DC. I'm not sure you need a lot of ICE agents in DC, as everyone seems to work for the government there, if they haven't been sacked yet. I did go to a ridiculous museum. I just must quickly mention it. Everyone said, have you been to the Michael Milken Museum, which is called something like the American Dream? They've turned Riggs Bank, just opposite the White House, huge, which used to be the Bank of Presidents, into this bizarre cult called the American Dream. You cannot imagine anyone wanting to spend any amount, 5p on recreating the British dream here. But it's kind of, but it does make you realise why people assimilate, because it basically tells Americans how to be American, right? Whereas we don't have anything like that here, but, we could discuss multiculturalism and the failure to assimilate till the cows come home. But you would still not have anything like that, anything kind of as
chips and queuing.
Yeah.
That's what we need to...
And ligging, because you say that our reputation in America is that we're all freeloaders.
Yes, when the bill comes.
Damn right.
Great British tradition.
I enjoyed in your column, Rachel, the description of going through all the airport security in America. And actually, it's maybe even is a bit easier now than it used to be, which surprised me.
It was, it took minutes.
Did you use the app?
No, I couldn't even find my ESTA form. But all I did was just walk in, show my passport. Welcome to the United States, Miss Johnson. Enjoy your stay. I've had bad experiences before, as I talk about my baby
that's terrifying.
disappeared. He was 6 months old, and I just got a call from one of those kind of numbers recorded in the messages that said, your family is in detention. And I was like, what is going on? Had to hot-foot it to Dulles to spring my nanny and my 6-month-old baby out of a kind of detention centre because she had overstayed a visa 10 years before.
Yeah.
Oh, golly. I wanted to briefly mention the lovely Arts Lead by Richard Bratby, which is about the transatlantic liners that used to cross from Britain to America. the reason that we're running this piece is because the SS United States is due to be sunk in a few weeks' time. It made its maiden voyage in 1952, and its final voyage will be over to Florida, where it's going to be sunk. Rachel, have you ever travelled by boat to America?
Well, first of all, my parents moved to America in 1963, 63. Boris was born in New York in 64. And they, you went there by liner, and it's a crossing. It's not a cruise, it's a crossing. It goes from A to B. A cruise goes A, B, C, D, E. And I think there's a real drama and romance in the great ocean crossing. And I've done the Atlantic twice, courtesy of the Times Cheltenham Literature Festival. And
I was invited on that once, and I had too much work to do.
Work on board
You can get a lot of work done, presumably.
One of my great regrets
I
that
think
I didn't get to do that.
I would like the Spectator to start its
We need a
own.
Spectator.
We did the Spectator cruise.
We did. Bring it back.
Yeah, we did one.
Bring it back.
No, my point is cruise or crossing.
Maybe Spectator crossing is better.
Yeah.
So if it goes from New York to Southampton, that's a crossing.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Okay.
I'm on board. Get it?
Great.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
We can do one of the
We'll
podcasts
pressure
on
our
it.
commercial apartment. We'll get it done.
I would love it. It's so fun. You do put on about half a stone because there's what we called the trough, which is an all-day, all-night free cafeteria.
Yeah.
And it was incredible how hungry you got, and it's because of the sea air.
Do you go a bit mad all that time?
You go
in there?
mad, literally about day 6, you go mad, and then you push on through. And by the way, when you cross the point where the Titanic sunk, they ring this mournful bell, and everyone sinks and looks out,
Yeah.
tries to look for the ring.
Goodness.
No, it's very romantic. And I actually crossed on with a man called Simon Winchester, which is an education, because the book that he was talking about on board was called The Atlantic. So, I mean, who better than to cross the Atlantic with than Simon Winchester?
Finally, I want to mention Sean Thomas's piece. He's written a lament for his libido, which he says comes and goes like really bad Wi-Fi or the Christian faith of an Anglican bishop. Rachel, did you feel any sympathy for Sean?
Look, I'm not male, so I can't claim like Kingsley Amis that I was ever chained to my lunatic libido or whatever, whoever we attribute that famous quote to. Sean's piece is a must-read, though, I should say. And I think a lot of men will relate, and men of a certain age will relate. By
Some
the
in
way,
the Johnson family?
no, shush. Hush your mouth, Tim. On a side note, though, apparently Manjaro removes appetite of all sorts.
Yes, I've heard that.
And so, I think something like 8% of the United States population is on weight-suppressing drugs now, and 6% of this country. So basically, Sean is ahead of the curve here. Sean is probably, a lot of men will be experiencing or are experiencing symptoms or feeling similar to our
Sean is ahead of all curves by the sound of it, according to his piece.
He has slept with an awful lot of women.
Yes, I mean, I really do love Sean's piece, because I think there is a real sadness to it. There's a sort of, it's quite scuzzy in a way.
It's an elegy.
But I sort of love the honesty of it, and it's just sort of eye-opening, his kind of whole experience. And I like the fact you mentioned Kingsley Amis, because it did remind me a bit of his novel Jake's Thing, about a man who's losing his libido, and the sort of the sadness of it. And the funny conclusion, I think, to Sean's piece is, yes, it's a bit like being chained to a maniac, but he also weirdly misses the maniac, even though at the same time he feels liberated not to be feeling so horny all the time. He also slightly misses that as well, which is a sort of, I guess, quite a conflicting emotion to have by the end of it all.
What do you have to say, Tim?
I mean, he's just a bit pleased with himself, isn't he?
Is it weird to reveal the number? That was the thing.
Well, lots of people sort of used to talk about that in their 20s, I think. It's quite unusual to talk about it in your 60s.
I do think.
I mean, the number, we haven't said the number.
Yes,
the number is 350, of which he pays 250.
Yes.
But even so, he sort of says, that still leaves 100 women who agreed to couple with me, so it is still pleasing.
I must say that the women who did agree to couple with him won't be feeling they made possibly the best choice of their
They're not
lives.
going to feel very special as a result of this.
women hate the kind of Casanova types, the Georges Simenon who claimed to have slept with 3,000. You just, you feel you're just one in a conveyor belt.
As a man whose number is beneath 350, I'd be tempted to say, well, why do you all sleep with quite so many of them? But,
it's the maniac. He's chained to the maniac.
No. He can't help it. The people who can help it are the women. Don't do it.
This piece will probably help it.
Speaking of out of control men, Lara, can we talk about Grok?
Yes, because Toby has written his column about Grok. He says that essentially Grok is doing nothing that Botticelli wasn't doing back during the Renaissance. Rachel, what did you make of that?
Quite an extraordinary argument.
I thought Toby was bang on the money with this. I'm not sure what the panic is about. We do have the online safety bill. We have, various other bits of statute which prevent this sort of, illicit, unlicensed pornography, especially of children, with, images created without consent. I don't understand. Is this a diversionary tactic on the part of Keir Starmer? I mean, you can't possibly close down X. It's where X% of the country get their news from. I don't understand the obsession with this story.
But the point that Toby makes really clearly, I think, is that there already, as you say, there already is a law against sharing, revenge porn, sharing real images of intimate images of women, or men, I suppose,
or anyone,
or anyone.
Children, yeah.
But the thing which Grok does is it's a fake image. It's imagined. I guess the difference is it's just between that and just sort of drawing or photoshopping a horrible fake image, some pervy image of a woman, is that it just takes 2 seconds. Yeah. That's the difference, isn't it? It's just the speed at which any old pervert or anyone who wants to sort of harass a woman now can just, get an app to do it for them. If you're going to be a creep, at least put the effort in. To make your own imagery. Don't get an app to do it for you. But you coward.
It doesn't do nudes anyway.
That's true. It doesn't do nudes.
So Grok has a sort of, a break, which means that you can't get a nude image.
I think it's going to lead to sort of catfishing with people uploading much better images of themselves.
More flattering.
Men are going to be confused.
So you say, Grok, give me a bit of tan line.
Kind of.
Or make my Tinder profile hotter.
Basically, yeah. And then men are going to be complaining.
Words I never thought I'd be saying in a Spectator podcast, but there we are.
I mean, the damaging thing here is it's just revealed what's in a lot of people's heads, isn't it?
Yes.
Lots of people go around imagining other people naked, and frankly, they should stick to that rather than whacking it into AI.
Well, Rachel, Tim, thank you very much for joining.